We all love sports. There are hundreds of them. Team competitions and individual sports. And each one of them seeks to bring people together. However, as professional sports become more spectacularized and commercialized, the avenues for exploitation also increases, leading to various forms of abuse, including human trafficking and forced child labor. At Mission 89, we seek to mitigate child trafficking in sports through research, education, and policy implementation to make sports, all sports, safer for children. Today, we have the honor of welcoming Mr. Benjamin Smith, Senior Officer of Child Labor Division at the International Labour Organization here in Geneva, Switzerland. He'll be telling us a little bit about these issues with the following questions.
Started my career with the ILO in 2000. I was working in a couple of countries in the Latin America region, working with our member states, governments, but also workers and employers. So in the field posts where I was working at the start of my career with the ILO, kinds of child labor that are considered worst forms of child labor were the use of children for commercial sexual exploitation was a concern. Also hazardous work. So children working in, for example, to harvest sugarcane, to catch fish, going out in boats on the high seas, making fireworks in very dangerous sort of hidden workshops with no safety and no adequate safety measures in place. So that is really where I cut my teeth in working directly with communities and with governments on the problem. At that point, I became quite interested in the supply chain angle. That has been an interest throughout my career. I continued to work on business responsibility to respect children's rights to be free from child labor. And our programs, which are in about 60 countries, are really quite diverse. So I work to support those projects as well from headquarters. It means that those social partners, workers and employers, have a seat at the table with governments, and that's unique in the UN system. The ILO establishes international labor standards, so these are international treaties that countries ratify to set the minimum standards for protections at the workplace. These standards aren't drafted just by governments. Workers and employers have a hand in it and in adopting them. So that means that those standards are consensus-based and that they reflect the real economy, employers and workers' concerns, and that process of social dialogue to arrive at implementable standards that reflect practical considerations in the workplace is ensured. So social dialogue and tripartism, the collaboration amongst social partners, is the way that the ILO pursues its mission of social justice and peace. So I mentioned the international conventions that the ILO establishes, and when countries ratify them, they accept being monitored. And so there's a whole supervisory mechanism, as we call it, within the ILO to hold governments to account. Are they actually implementing what is on paper in those conventions? So the tripartite nature of the ILO also means that workers and employers organizations have a say and can raise concerns within the ILO's supervisory mechanism. And that's what happened in the case of the Emirates. Children being trafficked from countries like Sudan, Pakistan, Mauritania into the UAE for exploitation as camel jockeys. They were prized, for their lightweight, basically, and children who had been trafficked were put on crash diets to lose even more weight and just subject to horrible circumstances and exploitation and forced to ride these camels. Quite obviously a dangerous thing to do and hazardous work for those children. So the workers group of the ILO brought this to the attention of the organization, and the case was taken up to the government of the UAE. And that process of social dialogue, of discussing and providing a space for the government in an atmosphere of neutrality that the ILO brings, led to a resolution. And it was interesting. It was a technological fix that played an important part in that. So robots were introduced to replace those children. Then technical assistance to help children who had been trafficked get back to their countries, get back with their families and communities, and receive the rehabilitation services that they need. So collaborated with UNICEF in particular for a big program to provide the assistance. So it's an example, our conventions being applied and pressure being applied through those conventions to resolve a very difficult problem that needed urgent attention, because that, without a doubt, was one of the worst forms of child labor, the situation with camel jockeys. So I think that the rights-based approach is important. The ILO has adopted a declaration on the fundamental principles and rights at work. So these include child labor, forced labor, non-discrimination, freedom of association, and collective bargaining. And the significance of that is that regardless of whether countries have ratified the individual conventions or not, the ILO in a declaration in 1998 said these are universal rights that all countries, by virtue of being a member of the ILO, need to respect and uphold. So that defining of children's rights when it comes to child labor is important. These are minimum rights that all children have, and whether it's football or camel jockeying, whether it's baseball, or whether it's children being used to make the gear, the sporting goods in supply chains that go into and are used by sport. All children have those rights. So that where rights and sport come together, I think, is where the mission of your organization and the ILO and anyone concerned with children's rights really is joined up. So I think, to answer your question about camel jockeying, the lesson for me is for any organization working in this area, consider engaging with employers organizations, workers organizations, as well as governments, because within the ILO system, they have power, they have a seat at the table, and they can raise complaints and get sustainable action and solutions to these issues. I mean, sport has been on the agenda of the ILO since almost the beginning of the organization, and we just celebrated our 100th anniversary last year. It's most recently been taken up just, in fact, in January. Seems like another era, but in January there was a global dialogue on decent work in sport, hosted by the ILO. And this allowed for a tripartite discussion, but also with civil society, NGOs such as yours also had an opportunity to discuss fundamental labor rights in sport and that connection between the two. I think that certainly everyone recognizes the incredibly positive side of sport in terms of, just inspiring people. It's an important part of so many children's upbringing, socialization, so many good values can be imparted by sport, and it really inspires people in every country. But there are, of course, rights abuses associated with sport, and so those need attention, and the victims need remediation, and that is directly connected with how they're represented. Are there trade unions that available? Can they raise a complaint when there are problems? Children face huge challenges, obviously, and there's been a lot that you're very, very familiar with of the abuses of children in amateur sport as well as in professional sport. So that Global Dialogue Forum was an opportunity to put it again on the ILO's agenda and have a good discussion. ILO is also part of the Advisory Council of the Center for Sport and Human Rights. So we're very active together with workers and employers organizations, governments, civil society, sports governing bodies in advising and supporting the work of that center that was launched a few years ago, and I think provides a very good space and a unique platform to raise concerns about rights, violations of human rights in the world of sport, and organize collective action to respond. So I would say those are a couple of the areas where we're working. Of course, in our projects on child labor, against trafficking, we work on improving legislation and government capacity to respond. And I think that benefits in terms of prevention and remediation, trafficking generally, whether it's in sports or not. One of the early kind of landmark projects of our child labor program in the 1990s actually was in response to the problem of children stitching footballs that were later used in professional soccer, professional football. And so this was happening in Pakistan, and these very high quality footballs were hand stitched by children working alongside their parents, deprived of school and facing serious repercussions, physical repercussions, working all day long, stitching these footballs. So ILO got involved with the Sialkot Pakistan Chamber of Commerce and UNICEF to set up a response. And again, the initial impetus came from our supervisory mechanism, so a complaint being made. And there, stitching centers were established where adults could come and do that work. There was regular monitoring. And there was also childcare provisions so that particularly women, mothers, could continue to earn a wage while having that assurance that their children were well taken care of, those younger children. So that gender aspect was quite important to that project. And so that eventually became a mature sort of ongoing mechanism that ILO passed off into the hands of the organizations in Sialkot. And so it's an example of where sport and child labor were connected in a terrible way, really. And I think that there's risk across other sporting good products, let's say, whether it's in uniforms or other gear, that sporting organizations, sports bodies should be aware of that risk and take steps to understand what's happening in the supply chain and take good faith measures to prevent and remediate child labor. There's an important and a real need for good data and evidence around these issues. So we hear a lot about, at least in these circles that we run in, about trafficking to Europe, for example, in football. So children that show promise in football then brought to Europe with big promises about being able to try out for the English Premier League clubs or whatever it may be. But then when that doesn't work out, and in most cases it doesn't, then it's being kind of just abandoned or so that trafficking element. So a lot of anecdotal evidence, I would say, but more research into that area so that we have a better idea about the scale, scope, the nature of that would be quite helpful to be able to organize appropriate responses. You have to understand what exactly the dimensions are and the nature of the problem. So I would say research, quite important. Advocacy, of course. The sport is an interesting one. It's transnational. You have sports governing bodies that are a little bit kind of in between in terms of governance. What role do governments have in applying laws when it's an international federation, let's say? A lot of times it's in that kind of limbo where it's only sports governing bodies that are able to police themselves and to make sure that they're not connected with human rights abuses. I think advocacy around these issues and raising awareness so that governing bodies adopt good policies based on international human rights principles, based on things like the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, that's critically important. And then I think, just having a rights-based approach, so reference to ILO standards, reference to the International Bill of Human Rights is always important so that we're on firm ground and we can hold the governments and others to account based on these universally recognized human rights. Thank you very much.